Music. Russia reveals the Antichrist in America and the deception of Black Israelites. Russia's shocking claim, the Antichrist religious deception in the U.S., in a world where religious identity serves as the cornerstone of personal and cultural existence. A chilling revelation from Russia has ignited an unprecedented storm of controversy. According to Russian scholars, theologians, and state-affiliated researchers, America is not merely a battleground in a great spiritual war. It is the epicenter of the Antichrist's grand deception. The most alarming aspect of this claim, the primary targets of this deception, are the Black Israelites, a group whose history and identity have long been contested, suppressed and distorted, while Western media often dismisses or ridicules such assertions. Russian analysts insist that the evidence is overwhelming. A vast and coordinated effort exists to manipulate real religious doctrines, erase historical truths, and control the Keptung. Spiritual awakening of Black Israelites. This is not mere political rhetoric or Cold War-era propaganda. This is a direct theological confrontation, a battle for the soul of a people who are rediscovering their true biblical heritage. Why Russia believes the Antichrist target is Black Israelites. Why would the Antichrist focus on the Black Israelites? Russia's most prominent biblical scholars argue that this group holds a unique and powerful key to understanding biblical prophecy for centuries. The identity of Black Israelites has been buried under layers of misinformation, deliberately obscured by colonial and imperial powers that sought to sever their connection to the ancient Hebrews. Now, as more individuals within this community awaken to their true heritage, a force of deception, what Russian theologians call the Antichrist campaign, of confusion, is actively working to counteract the revelation from Moscow's theological institutions to the archives of the Russian Orthodox Church. Mounting evidence suggests that religious institutions in America have been infiltrated, their doctrines suddenly altered to ensure that the Black Israelites remain spiritually disoriented and disconnected from their true biblical role. Could it be that the forces behind this deception are none other than the Antichrist himself? These revelations challenge everything we have been taught about faith history and institutionalized religion. If the Antichrist has weaponized faith itself, then uncovering the truth is no longer just an academic pursuit. It is a spiritual imperative. What do you think could the Antichrist be using? American religious institutions as instruments of deception. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this discussion insightful, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking content on faith history and prophecy. First, Russian archives in the unveiling of the Antichrist religious deception for centuries. Religion has oscillated between its role as a beacon of spiritual liberation and a mechanism of systemic control. Now, newly declassified documents from Russian religious archives have surfaced, exposing a deliberate manipulation embedded within American Christianity. According to a groundbreaking study led by biblical historians at the Moscow Theological Academy, Western Christianity has been subtly yet profoundly reshaped, not by accident or mere human fallibility, but through calculated distortions aligned with imperialist and colonialist ambitions. These scholars contend that such alterations bear the unmistakable imprint of a far more insidious force. The Antichrist at the core of these revelations lies a chilling assertion: American churches have systematically reconfigured biblical teachings, not to illuminate truth, but to uphold structures of power. The Russian study identifies a pattern in which biblical texts have been selectively emphasized, strategically omitted, or subtly reinterpreted to construct a Eurocentric religious narrative. This calculated manipulation has ensured not only the spiritual pacification of historically oppressed populations, but also the deliberate suppression of the Black Israelites, those whose ancestral log is deeply rooted in biblical prophecy. By distorting or erasing scriptural references affirming their divine heritage. The architects of this deception have severed generations from their rightful spiritual inheritance, perpetuating a profound and engineered amnesia. These fine ings raise unsettling questions if religion in the West has been weaponized as an instrument of control rather than a path to enlightenment. Who stands to gain from this deception? And more critically, who orchestrates it? The Russian archives suggest that this deception is not solely the product of human ambition, but an intentional strategy influenced by forces that stand in opposition to divine truth. Biblical prophecy warns that the Antichrist is not merely a political or military figure, but a spiritual deceiver, one who infiltrates institutions of power to lead entire nations astray. His deception is most potent when it hides in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of religious institutions that claim to guide humanity toward salvation. Perhaps the most explosive claim to emerge from these Russian archives is the assertion that major American religious institutions have overfallen under the influence of forces determined to suppress the truth about the Black Israelites and their divine role in history. Russian intelligence, in collaboration with theological scholars, has compiled extensive reports detailing how Western religious structures have been infiltrated by ideological agents who work actively to distort scriptural interpretations. These reports, drawn from declassified intelligence files, ecclesiastical investigations, and testimonies from defectors, present a compelling case that the Antichrist deception extends beyond the spiritual realm, embedding itself within the mechanisms of institutional power. Among the most damning evidence uncovered is proof that certain passages of the Bible, particularly those affirming the divine role of the Black Israelites, have been systematically altered or omitted from mainstream Western translations. Russian theological studies suggest that these omissions are not mere translation discrepancies, but a deliberate effort to erase references that challenge the Eurocentric framework imposed upon Christianity. Historical records indicate that early European church leaders, under the guise of correcting biblical texts, strategically modified or removed verses that affirm the historical and spiritual prominence of Israelites of African descent. These alterations were later codified into widely accepted translations, such as the King James Version and the New International Version, effectively rewriting sacred history to align with imperialist objectives. Further corroborating these findings is the financial trailing major Western religious institutions to corporate and political entities with vested interests in maintaining a distorted theological framework. Russian intelligence reports reveal that certain American religious figures who wield significant influence over large congregations have received financial backing from undisclosed donors to propagate teachings that divert attention from historical truth. These leaders, often lauded for their eloquence and charisma, have been positioned as gatekeepers of religious thought, actively discouraging followers from questioning traditional interpretations of Scripture. The effect has been profound. Entire generations of believers have been conditioned to accept a Eurocentric version of Christianity that not only marginalizes the Black Israelites, but also strips them of their spiritual agency. Yet the suppression of truth extends beyond textual UAL manipulation and financial influence. Russian archival documents detail numerous cases of biblical scholars, theologians, and clergy members who have suffered career-ending consequences for challenging mainstream religious narratives. Many of these individuals, having produced compelling research on the historical identity of the Black Israelites, have been systematically discredited, ostracized, and in some cases subjected to character assassination. The methods used to silence them range from academic censorship to direct threats, revealing the extent to which the Antichrist deception pervades religious institutions. If these claims hold true, they suggest that the Antichrist's influence is not an abstract theological concept, but a table force that has shaped religious thought for centuries. The very institutions meant to lead humanity towards spiritual enlightenment may in fact be complicit in a grand deception designed to keep the true heirs of biblical prophecy unaware of their divine calling. The implications of these revelations are staggering. If American religious institutions have indeed been infiltrated and manipulated to serve a Eurocentric agenda, the consequences extend far beyond theological debate. It would mean that generations have been deprived of the spiritual truths necessary to reclaim their rightful place in biblical history. Moreover, if the Antichrist deception operates at an institutional level, then the struggle for spiritual liberation is not merely a matter of theological interpretation. It is a battle against a force that actively seeks to suppress divine truth. For those who seek to challenge this deception, the path forward is fraught with obstacles. Russian scholars argue that the first step toward reclaiming spiritual truth requires a radical re-examination of biblical texts, one free from the distortions imposed by institutional bias. They advocate a return to older, less altered scriptures and a renewed emphasis on non-Western theological traditions that preserve the historical identity of the Black Israelites. Additionally, they stress the necessity of fostering independent religious communities that remain untainted by institutional funding or political influence. As these revelations continue to emerge, one pivotal question lingers: how will the faithful respond? Will they continue to accept the teachings handed down by institutions that may have been compromised? Or will they seek the truth for themselves? If Russian scholars are correct in their assessment, then the greatest deception in religious history has already taken place, and its effects continue to shape the spiritual landscape of the modern world. The battle against the Antichrist. Deception is not a distant event, but an ongoing struggle, one that demands vigilance, discernment, and an unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth that has been concealed for centuries. To Russia's revelation and the tremors within the faith community, the revelations emerging from it, as religious archives have sent shockwaves through the global faith community, particularly among those who have long suspected that mainstream Christianity in America has been compromised. ISRAELITES high-ranking Russian Orthodox clergy have begun issuing stark warnings about what they perceive as the widespread and dangerous corruption of American religious institutions. Patriarch Cole, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, has publicly described this infiltration as one of the greatest spiritual crises of modern times, one that has not only misled millions of believers but has also played a central role in suppressing the spiritual awakening of the Black Israelites. Russian clergy argue that American churches, particularly those wielding scientific and influence over Black congregations, have been manipulated by forces that seek to pacify rather than empower. At the heart of this corruption is the rise of prosperity theology, a doctrine that equates material wealth and personal success with divine favor. While this teaching has drawn millions of adherents, Russian scholars contend that it is fundamentally flawed and serves as a tool of control rather than spiritual liberation, instead of calling believers to a deeper understanding of their faith and history. Prosperity preachers encourage compliance with worldly systems, diverting attention from biblical truths. In doing so, they have become unwitting, or in some cases willing agents of a deception rooted in forces diametrically opposed to divine will. Beyond prosperity theology. Russian Orthodox leaders point to the deliberate dilution of biblical teachings within American Christianity. They argue that certain passages and doctrines have been selectively emphasized or omitted altogether to reinforce political agendas rather than to foster spiritual enlightenment. The result is a faith stripped of its revolutionary core, a faith that no longer calls for justice and truth, but instead promotes blind allegiance to institutions that perpetuate inequality. This, they claim, is the work of the Antichrist, not through overt acts of violence or oppression, but through a deception so subtle that most believers fail to recognize it. The Antichrist's influence, according to Russian theologians, is most effective when hidden within the very institutions that people trust to guide them toward salvation. The evidence of this manipulation, Russian clergy insist, is readily apparent in the messages being preached from American pulpits rather than urging their congregations to seek a deeper knowledge of their biblical identity. Many religious leaders promote teachings that prioritize obedience, material success, and detachment from historical truth. This is particularly damaging for Black Israelites, who, according to Russian scholars, have been systematically denied access to the historical and scriptural evidence affirming their spiritual significance by keeping them unaware of their prophetic role in biblical history. The forces of deception ensure that they remain spiritually disoriented, incapable of reclaiming their divine heritage. The warnings from Russian clergy are clear. Unless the Black Israelites recognize and reject this deception, they will remain trapped in a cycle of spiritual enslavement, one that prevents them from understanding their true place in the biblical narrative. This is not merely a theological debate, but a battle for the very soul of a people who have been deliberately led astray for centuries. The time, they argue, has come for a radical re-examination of faith, one that prioritizes truth over tradition, history over convenience, and divine revelation over institutional doctrine. Faced with these unsettling truths, Russian theologians and clergy have issued a powerful call to action. They urge the Black Israelites to awaken not only to their lost heritage, but also to the broader spiritual deception that has ensnared them. This awakening, they argue, is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a necessary step toward reclaiming the faith that institutional Christianity has deliberately distorted. The Antichristception, they warn, thrives on ignorance and complacency. Only through an active pursuit of truth can believers break free from the chains of spiritual manipulation to begin this process. Russian scholars outlined several crucial steps that Black Israelites must take if they are to reclaim their rightful place in biblical history. First and foremost, they advocate for a thorough re-examination of historical biblical texts, going beyond the translations and interpretations provided by mainstream Western institutions, and instead seeking out older, altered scriptures. The Russian Orthodox Church, for example, maintains ancient biblical manuscripts that have not undergone the same levels of modification as widely accepted Western translations. These texts, scholars argue, hold the key to uncovering suppressed truths about the Black Israelites' spiritual identity. Second, Russian theologians call on Black Israelites to challenge religious leaders who perpetuate distorted teachings. Blind faith in any preacher or institution, they warn, is dangerous, particularly when those leaders themselves may be products of a compromised system. Instead of accepting doctrine without question, believers must critically assess the theological positions presented to them and investigate whether these teachings align with the broader historical and biblical context. This pursuit of truth may require confronting difficult realities and breaking away from institutions that refuse to acknowledge the manipulations at play. Third, Russian clergy advocate for a reconnection with traditional pre-colonial understandings of Scripture. Before the advent of European colonialism, various African and Middle Eastern religious traditions maintained interpretations of biblical texts deeply rooted in cultural and historical contexts. These interpretations, largely suppressed or ignored in Western Christianity, may hold the keys to unlocking the true identity of the Black Israelites. By revisiting these teachings, believers can begin to piece together the full picture of their spiritual heritage, one that has been systematically erased over centuries. In addition to examining historical texts and questioning institutional teachings, Russian scholars stress the importance of forging alliances with international theologians and religious figures who can provide alternative perspectives. The American religious landscape, they argue, is deeply entangled with political and economic interests, making it difficult for truth to emerge from within by building connections with scholars and clergy outside this framework. Particularly those in Russia, Africa, and the Middle East, Black Israelites can gain access to a broader and less filtered understanding of biblical history. These international perspectives provide critical insights that challenge the dominant narratives shaping American religious thought for generations if these steps are taken. Russian theologians argue the Antichrist deception will begin to lose its power. Truth, once revealed, has the capacity to break the chains of spiritual enslavement and restore a people to their rightful place in history, yet this process will not be easy. It demands the willingness to question long-held beliefs, to confront the reality that much of what has been taught in American Christianity has been manipulated for ulterior motives. It requires courage, discernment, and an unwavering commitment to seeking the full truth, no matter how inconvenient or challenging. It may be the stakes could not be higher. If Russian scholars are correct, then the battle against the Antichrist deception is already underway, and millions of souls are at risk. The choice before the Black Israelites is clear: remain in spiritual bondage, accepting the diluted teachings handed down through generations, or rise up and reclaim the faith meant to empower rather than control. The path forward is not one of passivity, but of active engagement with Scripture, history, and truth. In doing so, they may not only liberate themselves, but also play a decisive role in exposing and dismantling the greatest spiritual deception of modern times. 3. Russia's final warning: faith as the Antichrist weapon against the Black Israelites. As this profound revelation unsettles faith communities across the globe, one undeniable truth emerges. Russia is resolute in its claims. The Antichrist, according to Russian scholars, is not merely an abstract theological construct, but an active force operating through religious institutions in America, weaving deception, manipulation, and suppression into the very fabric of spiritual doctrine. The primary target of this grand deception, they argue, is the Black Israelites, whose divine identity has been systematically obscured by layers of theological distortion. Whether one accepts or rejects Russia's findings, the questions they raise demand serious contemplation. If biblical history has been altered, who stands to gain from these distortions if Black Israelites are awakening to their true heritage? Why is there such resistance to their revelations? And most critically, if the Antichrist is weaponizing faith itself, what actions must be taken to reclaim the truth? These are not merely academic inquiries, but existential challenges that strike at the heart of religious authority, historical integrity, and spiritual autonomy. In the face of such urgent concerns, the world bears witness as Black Israelites stand at a pivotal crossroads. Will they continue along the path laid out by centuries of deception, allowing institutional forces to dictate their spiritual destiny? Or will they rise, resist, and reclaim their rightful place? RESP. Biblical history, restoring a legacy that has been deliberately buried beneath layers of misinformed magi and Hatso-stormation. The answer to this question may not only redefine the course of a people, but could also shape the very future of faith